Our readings this week will focus on works by Ernest Hemingway and James Joyce, two important authors of the early 20th century. As I've mentioned before, the events that occur during an author's life oftentimes influence his or her writing to a profound degree. We can look at the biography to uncover these details, but we can also look into the historical account. Without question, the most transformative event occurring in the early 20th century was the First World War, which deeply impacted the writings of Hemingway and Joyce. The literature of this time period tends to be restless and cynical. It's not that the authors of this era were pessimistic, but the indescribable violence of the war left writers with a bleak outlook on the future. The famous American author Gertrude Stein used the term lost generation to refer to the young men and women who came of age during the war. To represent this shift in perspective, the traditional boundaries of art are being stretched and redefined. Cubism begins to sweep the world, and literature starts to lose its conventional shape and structure. As we move forward into our discussion on Hemingway, I think it's important to consider that, for the authors of The Lost Generation, the war never quite left them. Hemingway's characters often bear the scars of deep psychological traumas, and Hemingway himself is a compelling case study because of the fantastic yet tragic life he lived. As a Red Cross ambulance driver in World War I, Hemingway served on the Italian front and got an intimate education on the horrors of war. I won't fail to mention that the grisly scenes on the front lines were unlike anything ever witnessed before. World War I was unique in that it was the first mechanized war. The weaponry at this time was designed to leave the wounded broken, both physically and mentally. Some of the leading concerns for infantry were chemical warfare, machine gun fire, and artillery, and Hemingway would have seen or heard first-hand accounts of all of it. His exit from the war came when he was seriously wounded by mortar fire and sent to Milan to rehabilitate his injuries. In recognition of his bravery and tenacity during the war, he was awarded the Silver Medal of Military Valor by the Italian military. He wrote extensively on his experiences in the war, and it's safe to say that he carried his memories of the front line with him until the end of his life. Before the war, Hemingway had been a budding journalist whose works were published by his high school newspaper. He would eventually make a career out of the vocation, being hired by the North American Newspaper Alliance to report on the Spanish Civil War. His aptitude for reporting on the details left Hemingway with a deep understanding on the tissue of human suffering. His works pierce into the psyche of his characters, and especially in Hills Like White Elephants, we're not so much analyzing plot progression as we are character development. If you're a newcomer to Hemingway's work, you may find Hills Like White Elephants to be somewhat restraining. First, as a short story that focuses on a seemingly mundane conversation between two characters, the plot is more implicit than it is direct. The story features a man, known as the American, and a woman named Jig. From the conversation, we expect that the two characters are romantically linked. We also know that the characters are undergoing or expecting some transformation in their lives. Even though they are speaking casually over some drinks at a bar, there is a heaviness to the conversation as we detect there's some trouble dividing these two characters, but we're not entirely sure what it is. Much to our frustration, they dance around the issue, segueing from one observation to the next without really confronting their problem head on. Either this topic is not one they'd like to address in public, or it is one that is generally difficult for them to discuss candidly. The man alludes to a surgical procedure, an awfully simple operation, he says, and are waiting for a train to take them to Madrid to have this procedure done. There is a general nervousness hanging in the air regarding this operation, but the tension goes deeper than that and seems to hit at the core of this relationship. One technique that we're seeing at work here is Hemingway's theory of omission, also known as the iceberg theory. If the plot of Hills Like White Elephants seems to be buried amongst all this idle chatter about landscapes and licorice, then the effect is very much intentional. Hemingway believed in the strategic omission of details from a story, forcing the reader to draw his or her own conclusions based on dialogue, imagery, and symbolism. Though the characters don't actually spell it out for us, we know the hills must be a reference to something. They are described as looking white or having the coloration of white skin through the trees. The term white elephant is a reference in itself, that of an expensive gift that is cumbersome to maintain. We can imagine that, perhaps, this couple are expecting a white elephant to enter their own lives, and this operation in Madrid is the way they decide, or at least the man decides, to maintain this gift. We still haven't been told what the gift is, nor the operation, but we're aware that there's something hidden beneath the surface. In Hemingway's own words, the dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. In other words, we, the readers, are seeing only the tip of the iceberg as it concerns this relationship in Hills Like White Elephants, and we have to use our own instincts and intuition to fill in the blanks. You may also notice that Hemingway's writing style is plain and direct, largely devoid of embellishments. This is partially due to his education as a journalist, where the emphasis is on rendering as much information into as little language as possible. A consummate reporter, Hemingway was gifted with a keen eye for detail, and we find many instances of verisimilitude in the text, from the condensation on the beer mugs to the sound of a bead curtain raking against a wooden table. The story may be short on plot, but is not short on detail. The couple's travel bags are adorned with labels from the many destinations they've visited. We can imagine these bags being whisked through many busy train stations, traveling light and fast, going in and out of hotels, but here at this station, the bags are described as heavy, symbolizing an emotional weight. Though we may assume that the man and woman depart to Madrid, it's not without a pervasive sense of loss. But loss of what? When you read Hills Like White Elephants, do you get the sense that this couple is going to be changed forever? And what are they leaving behind? When we read a story like Hills Like White Elephants, we're tempted to subject it to the biographical treatment. Certainly the intimate characterization of the story must have a reference in Hemingway's own life. He could not have invented these details. They must have come from somewhere. And truthfully, Hemingway, being the massive public persona that he was, it is hard not to read his works as autobiographical. Many of the themes in his fiction, from being wounded in combat to having relationships spiral out of control, seem to mirror the actual life he lived. But if we look at Hills Like White Elephants as solely autobiographical, then we threaten the integrity of the work itself, because even if the characters were taken from Hemingway's own life, they still exist as characters in a work of literature, and they deserve to be examined based on their own merits. One of the more popular tools for examining characters is the psychoanalytic method, which, if you've looked at the syllabus, is the companion to the readings this week. Psychoanalysis comes into prominence in the early 1900s through the efforts of Sigmund Freud, who revolutionized the method. If Silas Weir Mitchell represented the old way of treating anxiety and depression, then Freud represented a new school that sought to treat mental disorders through psychotherapy, which included extensive talk sessions between patient and physician to uncover the root causes of said disorder. Freud believed that we unconsciously employ defense mechanisms to deal with our own private traumas and guard embarrassing, perhaps morally questionable behaviors from coming to the surface. If we apply this theory to the characters in Hills Like White Elephants, we must pay attention to the symbols at work, how the woman observes the parched brown landscape in the dry countryside with the rolling white hills, and how this represents growth, perhaps even life, in barren circumstances. When the woman remarks that the hills look like white elephants, she is rejected by the man, perhaps peeling back another layer to this complex relationship, as the man and woman do not appear to be in agreement. Actually, there is something between the characters that goes beyond mere disagreement. The psychoanalyst will see how conversation, idle chatter, and alcohol are employed as defense mechanisms to avoid talking about an uncomfortable subject that is perhaps also morally questionable for its time. The inner struggle of moral versus immoral is the linchpin of the psychoanalytic method. Freud himself found an apt subject for his method in the Greek tragic figure Oedipus. In the play Oedipus Rex, Oedipus is prophesied to kill his father and marry his mother. Though he strains against his fate, ultimately this is exactly what happens at the end of the play, and he deals with the realization of this heinous act by tearing out his own eyes, which is symbolic of the moral repulsiveness of the deed. As I point out in the handout, Freud writes, like Oedipus, we live in ignorance of the wishes that offend morality, wishes which nature has forced upon us, and after the revelation of which, we want to avert every glance from the scenes of our childhood. Continuing from the handout, in psychoanalysis, literature is positioned as the projection of an author's unconscious, repressed desires. Psychoanalysis might be considered a psychobiographical rather than biographical form of literary criticism, as the critic is not so much concerned with the text's external influences, but rather the effects these influences have on the author's psyche. Psychoanalysis can be applied to the characters within a text or to the authors themselves. In each case, the critic must uncover the experiences and deep psychological traumas that have imprinted themselves into the mind and dreams of the subject. I find this excerpt allows us to transition rather cleanly to Joyce, another pivotal figure in the literary modernist movement. I hadn't mentioned before that Hemingway spent a good portion of his adult life living in Paris. Among his contemporaries in this art circle were Joyce, Gertrude Stein, Pablo Picasso, Ezra Pound, and many others, and Hemingway counts Joyce among his best friends and influences in Paris. And Joyce, just like Hemingway, had a penchant for characters who are emotionally vulnerable. The protagonist of Araby, for instance, is not the well-traveled man of Hills Like White Elephants, but rather a young boy who has lived his entire life in ignorance of the adult world around him. He attends a Christian Brothers school, not unlike the school the Irish Catholic Joyce might have attended, and knows little outside of his family, school, and the idle pleasures of adolescence, such as he describes here. The cold air stung us, and we played till our bodies glowed. Our shouts echoed in the silent street. The career of our play brought us through the dark, muddy lanes behind the houses, where we ran the gauntlet of the rough tribes from the cottages to the back doors of the dark, dripping gardens where odors arose from the ash pits, to the dark, odorous stables where a coachman smoothed and combed the horse or shook music from the buckled harness. Early on, the protagonist associates mostly with children of the same sex, but when his friend's sister enters the story, we notice a change in the boy's tone. It would appear that this child would develop a bit of a crush on Mangan's sister, so much that he soon begins to fantasize about her and retreats to a darkened room to envelop himself in darkness so as to conceal his shame. This room had been the drawing room for the previous tenant of the house, a priest, and we can faintly understand the battle that must be occurring in this boy's head as he struggles to reconcile his moral obligations with his budding sexuality. He knows, or at least he thinks he knows, that his newfound obsession runs against his teachings at the Christian Brothers School. The school is not coeducational after all. Boys and girls do not attend the same classes. The boy is ashamed that this love interest is pulling him away from what he once was, but he cannot help it. The boy is growing, developing into something new. He is coming of age, inching into adulthood at a rate faster than he can truly comprehend. He sounds less like the youth who is blissfully in love than one who is betrayed by a new understanding of himself. At the end of the story, his eyes burn with anguish and anger, and he sees himself a creature driven and derided by vanity. The relationship of opposites helps us to develop a better understanding of Araby. Take a look at this slide and think about who represents, for example, youth, and who represents age. How about play and responsibility? In fact, all of these qualities are present in the work, and I invite you to explore them. Who represents sexuality? How about celibacy? Going further, what type of image does the boy wish to project, and what is the actual image that he projects? Is he confident or is he conflicted? Psychoanalytic theory would paint this boy as conflicted between two extremes, the newfound sexual energy within him and the Catholic restraint that he's been taught to exercise. And his anguished revelation at the end of the story is not unlike Oedipus's reaction at the end of Oedipus Rex. He may not inflict bodily harm on himself as Oedipus does, but the idea is still the same. The boy, like Oedipus, realizes that he's overstepped the boundary of moral propriety, of childish innocence, and can never go back. Similarly, the characters from Hills Like White Elephants know that they cannot go back to the way that things were. Both texts conclude with a sense of loss and emotional numbness, fairly common of World War I era literature. And that is going to conclude our presentation on Hemingway, Joyce, and psychoanalysis.